Welcome to the summary of the Genshin Impact main story so far. Before we get into it, a few things to keep in mind. First of all, if it seems at any point that I'm talking differently to normal, it's probably because I'm reading off a 6,000 word script that took quite a while to write. Secondly, since I'm trying to keep the summary concise, I will cut out most parts that aren't related to something relevant later on. Because of this, keep in mind, especially if you don't know the story, that I'm telling it in my own way rather than how the game did. And this could also mean that some things I say might not feel as significant as they did in their quests. And thirdly, for consistency, we'll have the main character as the female traveller and their sibling as the male. With all of that in mind, let's get into it. There are two siblings who travel across worlds, and after trying to leave one, they get stopped by someone who calls themselves the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles. The siblings try to fight this person, who we'll just call the Unknown God, and it ends with one of the siblings disappearing, and the other trapped in a continent within this world called Teyvat, with their power sealed. This traveller then finds a floating thing called Paimon, and she agrees to guide them around Teyvat. As there are 7 nations with their respective archons, who are essentially gods, the plan is that the traveller meets up with each archon to see if they know about this unknown god. These archons are associated with 1 elements: Animo, Geo, Electro, Dendro, Hydro, Pyro, and Cryo. The first stop on the Teyvat tour is Mondstadt, the nation of Animo, which is the element kind of about wind. Interestingly enough, there are also statues of archons, and after interacting with an Animo god statue, the traveller actually gets Animo powers. A dragon then randomly appears, and once the duo sneak up on it, they notice this green guy talking to it. The dragon then detects the Animo power from the traveller, and flies away, along with that green guy disappearing. However, the dragon leaves behind some kind of red crystal, so the duo decide to pocket it. Just before making it to the main city of Mondstadt, the duo also gets stopped by someone called Amber, who is from the Knights of Favonius. Traveller whips out the sympathy card of their sibling disappearing, so naturally Amber had to give them a tour of the city. Not only that, but she gives the traveller a wind glider, so they can glide in the wind. The dragon appears again. The wind gets so crazy that the glider actually helps the traveller in driving the dragon away. Afterwards, the traveller gets brought to the headquarters of the Knights in order to meet with their acting Grandmaster Jean. They then do some stuff to try and weaken the dragon. In the process, the traveller learns that most people who are able to use elemental powers need a vision which is given to them by gods. It also gets found out that the dragon was known as Natlan and used to be like a protector of Mondstadt. Paimon actually manages to spot that green guy who was talking with that dragon, and after catching up to him, he introduces himself as Venti the Bard. And when the traveller gets out the crystal to ask about it, it's blue instead of red. Venti explains this to actually be a tear from Natlan, and the red colour that was there before was this corruption from something called the Abyss. As the crystal is blue now, it has been purified, and it's for this same reason that Venti thinks Traveller is key to helping Natlan get purified, if you will, as Natlan was only acting this way because of his corruption. So, naturally, the next step is for them to break into a cathedral, steal a holy lyre which the Animo Archon used in order to calm Natlan down. After sneaking in though, the Fatui mage appears and snatches it up. Now, the Fatui are this big organisation from another nation called Khaenri'ah, and, well, are a tad sketchy. The traveller escapes the cathedral guards because they're the only ones spotted, and goes to a tavern. Luckily, the tavern owner, D-Luke, covers for the traveller, and after Venti does some singing, D-Luke decides to join them in getting the lyre back from the Fatui. Jean also ends up going with them too. Once they get the holy lyre from the Fatui, the gang call up Natlan, and Venti whips out the singing again. As this happens though, an Abyss Mage appears and gets Natlan to leave. Jean also suspects Venti to be the Animo Archon, which he confirms to be correct, but what's made clear from this turn of events is that the Abyss Order, this other organisation which is up to dodgy stuff, they're able to control Natlan because of his corruption. We get to then follow that mage, and what we next see is them reporting back to none other than the traveller's sibling. The gang then meet up with the Varling yet again, and after some fighting, the Traveller manages to purify him, so we get a happy ending. That is until a Fatui Harbinger appear. These are the big higher-ups of the Fatui, and this one decides to slap up Venti and take a gnosis from him. This is then explained by Venti to essentially be the main source of power for an Archon, kind of like how regular people need a vision. And with that, the story of Mondstadt is done. We know that the Fatui are trying to get gnosis from Archons under the order of Snezhnai's Archon, and that there's this other organisation called the Abyss Order, which the Traveller's sibling is part of. Next up is Liyue, the Geo Nation, that is to say, the Earth element. Meeting their god turns out to be a whole lot easier because they appear every year to say if the nation is doing okay. Unfortunately, that god dies. Since the Traveller and Paimon get there as it happens, they are instantly suspected and get chased. Someone called Child helps the duo and reveals himself to be another Fatui Harbinger. He tells them that to clear their suspicion of the murder, they have to get a good word in from the Adepti, who are a bunch of divine beings that protect Liyue. The Adepti are surprised about the Archon's death, but believe the Traveller are not killing him, so the suspicion gets cleared. Instead of going to the next nation though, the Traveller still wants to get to the Geo Archon despite their death. So Child introduces them to Zhongli. Since Zhongli's from a funeral parlor, he can make stuff happen. The duo then end up going to the place where the Archon is being kept. Child then fights them and tries to take the Geonosis from the Archon's body, but finds out nothing is there. He then assumes the Traveller somehow got a hold of it, so he starts to get angry, but then gets beaten up. After fleeing, he then unseals Osial, a god that the Geo Archon beat up way back. This god then gets defeated by tons of money being thrown at it. Now that things settled down, something else is realised. The Geo Archon has to still be alive because the Gnosis is nowhere to be found. The duo look for Zhongli because he'd be the most likely to have an answer, but then find him in a room with Signora, the Harbinger that beat up Venti, and Child, the Harbinger that got beaten up. They then reveal that Zhongli is in fact the Geo Archon, but he already had an agreement to give the Fatui his Gnosis. This was because he wanted to retire, but was unsure on whether Liyue would be safe. So he let Osial be unsealed to put the nation to the test on how well they'd do. With that, Liyue is done, but before the next nation, there's another important story which starts. To keep it very simple, there's a guy called Dainsleif. Through doing some stuff, we learned some things. First of all, the Abyss is a very dangerous power, and of course is the kind of stuff that corrupted the Varlim back in Mondstadt. The Abyss Order is a group which uses this power. If you remember, the Traveller's sibling seems to be part of this, and the Traveller actually finds this out as they briefly come face to face. Then we have Khaenri'ah, which is an old nation that got destroyed by gods 500 years ago, presumably because its people did not worship a god. The strange thing about this nation is that the Traveller seems to remember things about it, and Dainsleif was in fact a royal guard from that nation, even though he should have long since been dead. We now have Inazuma, the Electro Nation, electrical lightning if you will. Straight off the bat, we have problems. They don't like people migrating, and the Electro Archon is also demanding for the people to give up their visions, which, if you remember, were what allowed for people to be able to use elemental powers. Not only this, but it seems that someone is specifically trying to keep the Traveller at Inazuma's borders on purpose. We find out later that this is just Signora. Luckily, the Traveller is able to pose as a bodyguard for someone sending a letter, so they're able to make their way into the nation. While the Traveller was at the border, they met up with someone called Toma, and the thing is, he's part of a clan that's trying to go against the Vision Hunt decree, which is the demand for people's visions to be taken away. And through being with this clan, there's a possibility to meet the Archon. Also, just seeing the state that people were in when they lost their visions, the Traveller decided it was best to help this clan. Some stuff then happens and Toma ends up getting captured so that his vision gets taken away. As the Archon is there for this, the Traveller then shows up starts fighting them, gets sent into a different realm where only the Archon is, gets decimated, and then runs away. As the Traveller is now wanted, they escape to a rebel army. It then turns out that this army was being helped by the Fatui, which was supplying something similar to a vision called a delusion. I didn't mention it at this point, but these were usually used by harbingers, such as Child when he fought the Traveller in Liyue. The problem is that delusions take away people's vitality, so they are dangerous to use. The duo then break into a factory which was making them, and get stopped by another harbinger called the Balladeer. Luckily though, Yaimiko manages to save them. She's yet another person trying to go against the Archon's plans, and thinks the Traveller is very important for this, as they have to be considered dangerous for the Archon to have put them in that other realm when they fought. Some more stuff happens, and the Traveller ends up in a room with the Archon and Signora. In order to leave without getting arrested, the Traveller has to beat Signora in a fight. As she then ends up losing, the Archon executes her and lets the Traveller leave. The building, that is. So, the Archon and Traveller then fight. Yaimiko makes an appearance to help, because she is actually some kind of familiar of this Archon. The Archon then loses and agrees to stop the Vision Hunt decree. The reason behind this decree in the first place was actually that the Archon was scared of Inazuma facing that same kind of fate Khaenri'ah had. So she thought the best bet was to kind of just keep it the same way it always is. And with Inazuma done, we finally have a nation where the Fatui don't get a gnosis. If only it didn't turn out that in order to save the Traveller from the Balladeer, Yaimiko gave up the Electro-Gnosis in exchange. And before leaving, Yaimiko also whips out some crazy information. The Balladeer was actually a puppet made by the Electro Archon, and after being abandoned, he ended up with the Fatui. Now, something else which is also a trend before each new nation is Dainsleif. Again, to put his meeting into simple terms, Dainsleif reveals that he was kind of like a Paimon for the Traveller's sibling, where they would journey across Teyvat together. It also turns out that Hilichurls, which are basically just these common monsters you see all over Teyvat, are actually all former citizens from Khaenri'ah, who were cursed by gods during Khaenri'ah's destruction. The other people from Khaenri'ah are like Dainsleif, where they are still human, but cursed with immortality. And finally, we also learn that the Abyss Order seems to have some kind of project going on called the Loom of Fate. The next nation is Sumeru. Well, most people call it Sumeru, the Land of Wisdom. Their respective element is Dendro, which is kind of just plant stuff. Upon arriving, the duo are a bit lost, so they try asking a passerby, but get no response back, so they start following her. After reaching the cave, the Traveller then gets hit by hallucinogenics, and starts seeing a giant tree known as Irminsul. Traveller then wakes up in the care of Tighnari and Collei. From hanging out with Collei, the duo find out about the Dendro Archon. The previous one was known as Rukkhadevata, and she died during the Cataclysm, that is to say when Khaenri'ah fell. The current one is Kusanali, who was found when Rukkhadevata died. Unfortunately, there is a problem with Collei. She has Elazar, which is a disease unique to people in Sumeru. For a while, her condition was getting better thanks to Dottore, one of the Fatui Harbingers, but the very same guy also experimented on her to the point of trauma being developed, so he's not the best of people. Tighnari also brings up some information related to this Elazar condition. The thing is that the Irminsul tree which the Traveller saw stores all of the information onto that. The Withering is something which damages the environment and even infects Irminsul. Through this, those with Elazar get worse, but the reason behind this happening is unclear. After some time, the duo then make it to the city. Everyone there wears an Akasha terminal, which lets them learn a whole bunch of information. When they ask around, the duo end up talking to Dunyazad, who wants to bring back the Sub-Zero's festival, as it used to be a celebration for Kusanali's birthday. However, when it's time for the festival, the Traveller starts to realise that the day is repeating itself. A whole bunch of loops later, someone called Nahida appears, and brings back the memories which the duo lost for each repeat. From this, it's discovered that Nahida is actually Kusanali. As it turns out, the sages of the academia, basically the higher-ups of all of Sumeru, are behind the day repeating itself, and they achieved this through having everyone's consciousness connect to someone else's dream with the Akasha terminals. But this also means something else. The Dendro Archon is not actually in control of what's going on, and she was in fact captured by the academia when she was first found. Question is though, why the sages were trying to harvest the consciousness of people. As it turns out, they're trying to create a new god with the help of the Touré, that harbinger I mentioned. So there are two goals, saving Nahida and stopping the creation of a new god. While saving Nahida didn't take much trouble, the new god was kind of successfully created, so a fight was in order. If you remember the balladeer back in Inazuma, he was the one turning into a new god by being put in a giant mech powered by the electro-gnosis. Luckily, Nahida's a bit of a genius, so she whips out the same tactic of the day looping from the festival to the point where the traveller literally read all of the balladeer's attacks like a book. After winning, Nahida then uses the electro-gnosis to go to a memory of Rukkhadevata, the previous dungeon Archon. If you remember the problems I mentioned, where we had the Withering and Elazar affecting Irminsul, the cause was actually from Rukkhadevata having forbidden knowledge, which is basically information outside of Teyvat that causes corruption. I suppose a bit like the Abyss. Therefore, to save Irminsul and get rid of things like Elazar, Rukkhadevata had to be completely erased from Irminsul, meaning that everyone will forget about her. And remember Dottore? He then appears straight after that happens and starts making deals with Nahida. She agrees to give away the electro-gnosis in return for Dottore getting rid of each clone he has, which, to put it simply, is the most effective way to weaken him. Nahida also then agrees to give away her dendro-gnosis for two reasons. One, it was only being used before for those Akasha terminals, and because of how they ended up being used, she thought it was best to put a stop to them. And secondly, Dottore is able to give information related to the sky of Teyvat apparently being fake, because this kind of stuff can't be learnt through Irminsul. Now, before the next nation are quite a few things. Nahida's actually the first Archon to tell the Traveller anything properly useful, to be honest. She says that the three highest ranking Fatui Harbingers actually have strengths which rival the gods. First rank is Capitano, second is Dottore, and third is Columbina. Additionally, people who are not from Teyvat are known as the Senders. Traveller is considered to be the fourth, and for some reason their sibling is not one, because Irminsul has information on them. Not only this, but the siblings started their journey in Khaenri'ah. Also, Nahida reckons the first Ascender is the Heavenly Principles. This is the one who rules Teyvat, and is presumably up in Celestia, which is just this floating island in the sky. Keep in mind as well that at the beginning of the game, with the unknown god, they introduced themselves as the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles. Something else important is that the balladeer is currently being kept by Nahida after he lost, and after going into Irminsul, he finds out that Dottore effectively engineered a situation of his in the past that led to him joining the Fatui. From finding this out, the balladeer tries to erase himself from Irminsul because he regrets some things in the past, and this just makes everyone apart from the Traveller forget about him. So after restoring his memories again, he decides to stop being a Harbinger and basically just works for Nahida now. Because of this, I'll just call him Wanderer instead from here onwards. We finally then have the classic return of Dainsleif. The Traveller ends up seeing a past memory of their sibling, which shows the founder of the Abyss Order and how he tried bringing back his son who turned into a Hilichurl. While the son managed to gain consciousness again after the Traveller heard this weird abyssal voice, the son couldn't handle his current appearance as a Hilichurl, but we're not actually too sure what happened to him. The main takeaway from this though is that it may have been the turning point of when the sibling joined the Abyss Order, as they were still travelling with Dainsleif at this time. Next up is Fontaine, nation of Hydro, which is literally just water. It already starts off with the Hydro Archon Farina welcoming the Traveller, but what she hopes for is a fight, in court. Weirdly enough, this happens shortly after, where magician duo, Liyue and Lynette, end up with one of their assistants dying in a performance. Naturally, the duo end up being the lawyers for these magicians, as they are the main suspects, with Farina acting as a prosecutor. Liyue and Lynette are cleared, but it does turn out they are adopted children of Arlecchino, a Fatui Harbinger. Another big trial related to the previous one occurs, where disappearances were caused by primordial water, which is capable of dissolving Fontainians. Unfortunately for our boy child, the Harbinger back in Liyue, he happens to be in Fontaine and ends up as the primary suspect of the case. Knowing this to be wrong, the duo and a mafia boss called Navia find the real culprit, Barcel. What happened was was that his partner touched primordial water and dissolved, so he was trying to find a way to bring her back through testing diluted primordial water on people. In the court, a machine created by Khaenri'ah, that I'll just call the Oratrice for short, is used to give the final verdict. While it did say Marcel is guilty, it also then later says that Child was guilty, landing him in prison too. Of course, Child does try fighting back, but Nervalet, the judge, casually one-shots him. So obviously, the reasonable course of action is to have the duo go to prison for a bit to check on him. While there, Child was nowhere to be seen, and the only clues given were visions of him in prison that the traveller dreamt, meaning that they only knew Child was missing. A whole bunch of stuff happens, and Risley, the guy in charge of the prison, shows the duo that there is this gate which holds back all the primordial water, and since the levels have changed in recent times, it means that it has been leaking into the ocean. After some time, that gate actually bursts open, but the duo go out of the prison ahead of time to tell Nervalet, so he casually solves the problem. While that happened, the traveller swaps places with him, where they are instead protecting Khaenri'ah while she has a meeting with Arlecchino. And here's a good time to bring up something that has been looming over the nation this whole time. There is a prophecy that all Fontainians are born with sin, and the water levels will rise to the point of them drowning, leaving just the Hydro Archon alive. Because Arlecchino is worried about this prophecy coming true, she asks Khaenri'ah calmly about what her plan is for saving everyone. And while Khaenri'ah says she does have a plan, she doesn't give any details about it. After the meeting, the duo talk to Arlecchino, and she casually brings up the fact she previously attacked Khaenri'ah but found no gnosis on her, making Arlecchino suspect that Khaenri'ah isn't the real Hydro Archon, as she could only sense some kind of curse on her. The duo also learned something even crazier from Nervalet. He's the Hydro Dragon Sovereign. The Dragon Sovereigns are beings that used to rule Teyvat until the Heavenly Principles arrived. Not only this, but all of the Gnosis were actually created with part of the Sovereign's powers. Because of this, Nervalet could only help against the prophecy of Fontaine if he was given back the authority which the Hydro Archon has. Things then go quite crazy. Khaenri'ah gets put on trial for being a fraud, and is presumed to be by the fact she is affected by primordial water. After going to the Oratrice, however, it says the Hydro Archon is guilty. But of course there's a bit of confusion since Khaenri'ah isn't supposed to be the Archon. The next step was to analyse stone slates which symbolised the prophecy. As it turns out, Egeria, the previous Hydro Archon, turned Oceanids into humans. In other words, Fontainians were never truly human. This was achieved through the use of primordial water, so people were dissolving from contact with it because they were returning to their original form. The sin part of the prophecy was how the Heavenly Principles never approved of this creation happening. We then get a big flashback into Khaenri'ah's past. The reality of what happened was that the real Hydro Archon, Focalor, had been in the Oratrice the whole time. Khaenri'ah was just her human body, which she cursed to be able to live long, so the Heavenly Principles got deceived into thinking Khaenri'ah was the true Archon. Focalor then sacrifices herself in order to give Nervalet his authority back, allowing for him to save everyone. The only other problem is the truth behind the rise in primordial waters. As it turns out, there is a giant narwhal that has been in this water, and Child had been dealing with it since he went missing. Since Nervalet got his power back, the fight was quite easy, and Child's master Skirk appears to then capture it, because it was apparently just a pet of Skirk's master Sertologi. Skirk also mentions that Gnosis are remains of the third descender, which then makes the traveller wonder about themselves with that kind of stuff. But anyway, it looks like we finally don't have a Gnosis in the Fatui's hands. Never mind, I guess Nervalet just felt like giving Arlecchino the Hydronosis as thanks for her help. Also, we have the usual Dainsleif visit, but back in Sumeru again. He brings up the five sinners of Khaenri'ah, Vedifune, Rheindotter, Sertologi, Vevir, and Teroptite. The only ones to keep in mind though are Vedifune, who is the brother of Dainsleif, and was behind that weird abyssal voice from the memory of this sibling that the traveller saw last time. And then also you might have noticed that Sertologi is Skirk's master. Another interesting thing is the Loom of Fate. This is the main project of the Abyss Order, and is able to weave ley lines. In simple terms, it can change the memory of Teyvat in the same kind of way of how Irmin's soul can store memories. Now it is time for Natlan. The Nation of War. Their element is pyro, which is fire. We start with a tour from a kid called Khaenri'ah. It is learned that the war aspect of the nation isn't among the people, but rather against the abyss, as Natlan is affected by it the most. Because of this, they carry out competitions to determine who's strongest. They have a resurrection system as well, but if everyone in the group dies to the abyss, all of them stay dead, so it's more dangerous to have weaker people fight. As the Traveller isn't from Natlan, they can't take part in the competition, but Khaenri'ah does end up succeeding. Later, the duo go back to the stadium in which the competition took place in, to be there for Khaenri'ah's return from her battle with the Abyss. Since she died, she has to be resurrected. However, the Pyro Archon Malwika could not find her, meaning Khaenri'ah couldn't actually be brought back to life. What happened is that the Abyss found a way around this system so that they effectively just keep Khaenri'ah in the Night Kingdom, which is where the souls of the deceased go and is how the resurrections are possible in the first place. So to save Khaenri'ah, they have to go into the Night Kingdom and physically bring her back. While this happens, Malwika actually ends up fighting Capitano, the first ranked Harbinger I mentioned. Even though he still ends up losing, Capitano said some things beforehand that suggest he has a plan for saving Natlan and wants the Pyronosis for this. With some weird voodoo magic, the duo find out that Capitano's plan is to rebuild Natlan's ley lines in a similar way to the Loom of Fate that the Abyss Order are using. The problem with this plan, compared to Malwika's for fighting the Abyss, is that the Night Kingdom is what currently acts as Natlan's ley lines. By changing how that works, the souls in the Night Kingdom would get sacrificed, and the memories everyone has of them would go, kind of like if Firmin's soul got destroyed. Capitano then gets found, and after getting hit by some debate tactics, he decides to help with Malwika's plan instead. His reluctance to it before was because he was from Khaenri'ah, and thought that Natlan would face the same fate at the rate things were going, because Malwika was basically relying on the right people to appear when needed. And of course, the reason for his attachment to Natlan in particular was because he took refuge there after the Cataclysm. After some time, Giant War with the Abyss starts, and Natlan win. The Traveller and Malwika also then fight this really crazy abyssal boss that turned into a dragon. Despite winning, there is one final problem. The Ruler of Death, Renova, needs Malwika to sacrifice herself because of a previous deal they had. Here's the thing though, Capitano has some beef with Renova because she's the reason behind Carmians having the Curse of Immortality. It also turns out that the reason for the Cataclysm was related to the 5 sinners that Dainsleif mentioned before, so it's understandable that it feels unfair for the whole nation to get punished. Another reveal is that Capitano had been collecting souls which couldn't get into the Night Kingdom, so by sacrificing himself instead of Malwika, he gets back a bit at Renova since she's stuck with a paradox of trying to kill someone who's immortal, and he also gets to take the souls to the Night Kingdom. With that finished, the Fatui actually don't get a Gnosis for once this time, but we do end up losing our boy Capitano. Of course, we also get the return of Dainsleif, but this time I'd say there's only one significant takeaway. The Traveller's sibling ends up getting the Atlas of the New World, which has the ley lines to build a new Khaenri'ah, and with it, a chance of talking to the Heavenly Principles. Next up, we have something a bit different. Nod-Krai. The only remaining nation of the 7 left is Snezhnaya, and Nod-Krai is a region on the very edge of this, but is independent. Before we go further though, I think it's best to mention that this chapter is by far the longest compared to the others so far, and because of that, I'll make it in 2 parts instead. To start off with, we have some factions within Nod-Krai, such as the Fatui, who set up a giant base that looks straight out of Star Wars, the Wild Hunt, which is basically the abyssal monsters that appear, and the Frostmoon Scions, who worship the Moon Goddess. Now, even though I say Goddess is singular, there have actually been 3 moons in the past with their own respective Moon Goddesses, but 2 got destroyed when the Heavenly Principles and the Dragon King Nibelung fought. Now, as it turns out, the current Moon Goddess is none other than Columbina, the 3rd Harbinger, although at this point she had already decided to leave the Fatui. There's also something related to the Traveller in Nod-Krai. Nod-Krai. As it turns out, they originally arrived into that on a spaceship, and the place they landed was somewhere in this area. To find out more on this, they have to use a moon marrow, which is the remains of a previous moon goddess. However, the Wild Hunt manages to shapeshift into the Traveler's sibling to trick the Traveler into helping them get the marrow. Once the Traveler manages to get it back from the Wild Hunt, they just safeguard it in case the attack happens again. Through Columbina, it gets realised that the person behind the Wild Hunt attacking is Revere, one of the 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah that Dainsleif mentioned before. The reason why he doesn't seem to be too strong is because he fell into the moon's reflection and had to recover through the abyss. As he effectively died back then, the Wild Hunt in reality is actually just his remains. This does also mean though, by absorbing moon related energy, he can get back to his regular strength. And because of this, he baits a giant cannon that had moon energy into firing at him. So the Traveler and Flynn's, just this guy who fights the Wild Hunt, tried to deflect the shot. They didn't fully deflect it, so Revere still gets restored partly, but stays far weaker than he used to be back in the day. From looking at Revere's past in Khaenri'ah, the origin of the 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah actually gets explained for once. As it turns out, the king of Khaenri'ah was obsessed with abyssal power. The 5 sinners and Dainsleif had planned to fight the king, but Dainsleif was the only one to not then get tempted by the abyss. Although Revere specifically became a sinner because his partner fell into the moon's reflection before, so he wanted to find her. Surprise, surprise, since Dainsleif goes way back with Revere, it's only fitting that he's then here to help. But because Revere can't be completely defeated, he gets sent back to the moon's reflection again, where he then is forever trapped. And that is the end of Nod-Krai, or at least the part 1 of it. We then start off part 2 with a problem Columbina has. You see, this whole time, she was wanting to go back to the moon, but she never had the power for it. Some stuff happens, like her disappearing as if she's from Back to the Future, and it reaches a point of her starting to like being on Teyvat instead. Despite this, she still commits to going to the moon, and just as she's about to, boom! The man, the myth, the menace, the Toray takes her, and the moon marrows so they get some cool powers like freezing time. To kind of stop him from just taking over the whole world at that point, Columbina then decides to send herself to the moon's reflection, but because of that, she kind of goes missing. After tracking the Toray down, the Traveller then gets captured. The Toray monologues up a storm to convince the Traveller to join him, and then the Traveller gets a bit bored, so Wanderer suddenly appears to save them. While Columbina's in the reflection, she actually gets to talk to Revere, and it also turns out the way he was able to get his powers back and everything was actually from the Toray. So he was the one behind literally everything that was happening at this point. But afterwards, Columbina also realises that everything in the moon's reflection goes back in time, and she actually eventually meets the original 3 moon goddesses. It turns out that the reflection was made by Nibelung in order to keep the moon goddesses away from the fight with the Heavenly Principles. To escape, Columbina ends up getting the power of the 3 moons from these goddesses, so that she can match the Toray in strength. Once she returns, the Toray gets beaten up by the power of friendship. And to end this part off, Columbina also takes the Traveller to the moon, where they find out it had their spaceship the entire time. But wait, there's more. To make this easier, we may as well just call this a surprise part 3. The duo get a letter from Kole, if you remember back in Sumeru, and she had a dream where everyone was switched. After Kole says about this to Nahida, she reckons this is actually a sign of something to come in Irminsul. And it does turn out that there is a threat, as Irminsul was not getting any new information, so it kind of just meant the system was getting overloaded. After some stuff happens, Nahida decides to replace Irminsul. In Sumeru, I never mentioned this, but there's also this giant desert area, where a god from way back called King Deshret had some fancy technology, one being Aru. So the plan was to then use Aru like a new Irminsul. While preparations for this happen, Irminsul then actually appears in physical form within Teyvat. and for some reason this only meant one thing: Dottore is still alive. So understandably, the Traveller permanently borrows the Pyronosis from Malwika to give to Liyue so that she can burn Irminsul. What then gets explained is that Pantalone, a Fotui Harbinger, had an agreement with Dottore to put a backup of him into Irminsul. That is to say, there were two halves to Dottore left since the Gnosis trade with Liyue when I said about him having multiple clones. And so now one of the halves just died from the fight over Nod-Krai, and the other is now just in Irminsul. More stuff happens, then Wanderer and Traveller fight Dottore. Liyue then appears for some help, and the Pyronosis gets sacrificed to finally burn the tree. In the process, Dottore is then gone for good. And with that done, there are no more surprises because we've now caught up to the main story so far. So, to give a quick run through of some of the aftermath, the Fotui supposedly have 6 Gnosis, if we're going to assume that they already had the Cryonosis in their hands, and that the Pyronosis truly is gone now. The reason why they've been trying to do this isn't actually really clear, and we can only assume it's maybe for them to try and fight Celestia or something. The Traveller has also gotten much stronger over time. Remember, they went from being powerless against Signora back in Mondstadt to being able to beat her, to now almost being like a threat to people such as Dottore, who weren't even too far off being like a god. Now, do also keep in mind that most of the questions you might have from this summary are still unanswered. For example, Paimon's entire existence is kind of suspicious. The Traveller fished her out of the ocean, for crying out loud. But with all of that being said, I think it's best to leave it there, and I'll see you all in the next one.